Hi there. I'm Russell Field from the University of Manitoba. Welcome back to a different Five Rings. Today, I want to focus on a failed bid for the Winter Olympic Games that emerged from Canada, from the Canadian West in the mid-1960s, and that focused around concerns that activists had around the use of the natural environment and development of public parkland. And I want to do this in large part because the Olympics, in particular, the Winter Olympics, have been the focus of much protest around environmental issues. Indeed, many of the Winter Olympic Games, looking back from Pyeongchang 4 years ago and earlier, were the focus of protest by environmental groups. And indeed, environmental issues were a portion of what led citizens in Colorado to essentially return to the IOC the victorious Denver 1976 bid. 4 years earlier, or at least for the Olympic Games 4 years earlier in 1972, a group of citizens and business people connected to Calgary and to Banff, the resort town in Banff National Park, were bidding for the 1972 Games, a bid that was put forward in late 1964 after the same group had just failed by a vote of 27 to 24 to win the right to host the 1968 Games, which went instead to Grenoble. And felt as though they were the odds-on favorite for 1972 and proceeded to put forward a bid to the IOC, a bid that quickly in early 1965 found itself running aground of local protesters and activists on a number of issues. Groups like the Canadian Society of Wildlife and Fishery Biologists, the Canadian Audubon Society, and the National and Provincial Parks Association of Canada, as well as international opposition from the World Wildlife Fund, all of whom were focusing on the use of public parkland and development of public parkland and their opposition to that, especially in the face of the groups that they thought would benefit from such development. The proponents of the bid argued that the Banff National Park, which is Canada's oldest national park, had long been used by humans as well as wildlife, and that the Games would attract fewer people in the winter than the park normally attracted in the summertime at its height. Initial opposition, much different from our contemporary experience of environmental activism, consisted largely of resolutions passed at annual general meetings and newsletters sent out, and some letters being sent to the Canadian Olympic Association and to bid officials. When these proved largely unsuccessful, the bid proponents shifted gears and began a pretty active letter writing campaign to IOC members. And the IOC, in the midst of a series of issues that they were dealing with in the 1960s, many of which connected to the Cold War, grew increasingly uneasy that they would find themselves connected to local protests and began to find themselves uneasy. And when they met in Rome in April of 1966, every one of the IOC members there to vote on awarding the Games found in their hotel rooms a telegram from concerned citizens in Canada, again voicing opposition to the bid. Just after the Banff group had presented their bid to the IOC at the Rome IOC session, the president of the IOC, Avery Brundage, read a letter to the assembled group, detailing the protests and the opposition of local groups, concerns that the Banff bid was frustrated that they never got to respond to. By the time the meeting ended, the 1972 Winter Olympics had been awarded to Sapporo in Japan. And while this moment in time may reflect local concerns and indeed was voiced by local opposition, I think we can take from it a couple of things. The fact that environmental concerns grow in the 1960s as the environmental movement in its somewhat nascent form is gathering steam, perhaps the hallmark of which was the publication of Rachel Carson's A Silent Spring, calling attention to environmental or ecological destruction. The second thing I think we can take away is the use of tactics of fairly, by today's standards, in an era before groups like Greenpeace became more activist and took direct action. You see a lot of letter writing and resolution passing. A kind of safer environmental protest, if you will, a middle class kind of safe protest that the IOC was, who are a much smaller, less sizable organization than they are today, felt that they didn't want to get involved in. The context in 2022 is clearly very, very different, both in terms of the public discourse around environmental issues and climate change, and in terms of the IOC's position as an organization sponsored by multinational partners on a regular basis, and that very much shapes reactions to environmental protests today. But it's important to recognize that these environmental protests have a long history that demonstrates a considerable amount of change over time.